The dawn of the 23rd of August, 1914, came thin and grey over the Belgian town of Mons. A soft mist drifted above the canal, quieting the sounds of boots, rifles, and whispered orders. Men of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, had dug shallow positions along the banks of the Canal de Centre. They had marched for days, their uniforms still stiff from new issue, their minds still filled with the belief that this war would be short. Few among them understood that the next 48 hours would turn faith into endurance, and endurance into myth. The soldiers were professionals, Britain's small, regular army, men of the old regimental system. They were railway clerks and miners, farmers and mechanics who had worn a uniform for years before Europe went mad. To them, this was simply another posting, another enemy. They stood ready against the vast machine of the German First Army. 4 corps strong, commanded by General Alexander von Kluck, a hammer meant to crush France through Belgium. Across the water, through the morning haze, they could already hear it, the distant thunder of guns, rolling like summer storms, but colder, emptier. The French were fighting to the south, the Belgians had already bled to the east. And now, in the grey of Mons, it was Britain's turn. Captain Charles Ferguson of the Royal Irish Rifles remembered how the canal shimmered that morning, like a mirror ready to break. He recalled hearing the first German shells fall short, the sound like great doors slamming in the heavens. Riflemen at Nîmes Bridge watched as lines of grey coats emerged from the mist, hundreds, then thousands, advancing in silence. The Lee Enfield rifles cracked in disciplined rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that stunned even the enemy. Some German survivors later swore they faced machine guns. They were wrong. It was just British training, 15 rounds a minute, each shot deliberate. For a few hours, the BEF held back a force 4 times its size. At Nîmes, Lieutenant Maurice Dease commanded a single Vickers gun. 5 times he was hit. 5 times he stood again. When he fell for the last time, Private Sidney Godley took his place, alone at the gun, covering the retreat across the canal. He was captured, bleeding but alive. Both men would receive the Victoria Cross, the first of the war. Yet valour could not change numbers. By late afternoon, the German line extended beyond both British flanks. General Sir John French gave the order to withdraw. What followed was not defeat, but survival, the Great Retreat, a week-long march under unbroken pursuit. Men fought, fell, and vanished in ditches beside roads that ran red under August Sunday. And somewhere along that desperate trail, the first whispers began. No one knows who spoke it first, perhaps a chaplain, perhaps a wounded man in delirium, but the story spread as quickly as fear itself. That at Mons, when the British line was about to break, something luminous appeared between them and the enemy. Figures, radiant and silent, standing in the smoke. Some said archers, bows drawn, their arrows made of light. Others saw winged forms, white and vast, turning back the Germans. A few spoke of a shining host that hovered above the canal, faces calm as marble. The Germans, they said, had stopped firing. Their horses screamed and would not advance. To the soldiers still trudging through the fields of southern Belgium, the tale was a comfort, a thought to carry through the sleepless nights. For civilians back home, it became something greater. Proof that God watched over his empire's sons. Newspapers printed anonymous letters. A private in the Royal Irish reported that his entire platoon saw a line of shining men. A nurse wrote that a wounded corporal swore an angel shielded him from bullets. By September, the legend had crossed oceans. The truth, as it so often does in wartime, began elsewhere. A Welsh author named Arthur Machen had published a short story called The Bowmen in late September 1914. It told of exhausted British soldiers at Mons, rescued by phantom archers from Agincourt St. George's Host, returned to defend England's sons. Machen intended it as fiction, a modern parable of courage, but his readers believed it. Clergymen reprinted it as testimony. Pamphlets called it divine intervention. Within weeks, The story of the Bowmen merged with battlefield rumor, birthing the legend now known as the Angels of Mons. Arthur Machen was horrified. He wrote letters insisting it was a tale, not a revelation. But the age of reason had ended in the trenches. Logic drowned beside the men who once wielded it. What the public needed was not explanation but meaning, and meaning, in 1914, was in short supply. Back in Belgium, the retreat continued. Rain fell, and the roads became mud. Men collapsed where they stood. German cavalry harried the flanks, cutting off stragglers. Yet, despite exhaustion and despair, the BEF survived. Some soldiers later recalled moments of strange calm, of shells missing by inches, of feeling suddenly protected. Memory is unreliable under fire. Trauma distorts the lens, but belief, once born, does not need proof. By the time the BEF reached the River Marne, the Angel had already taken flight across Britain. Sermons invoked it. Illustrated magazines depicted radiant hosts hovering above the canal. One article described a pillar of light stretching across the battlefield. Another claimed German prisoners admitted to seeing heavenly warriors. There were even claims that entire battalions had vanished into the mist, carried away by divine hands. It was easy to believe. 1914 was a world still half in the 19th century, a society of church bells and empire, of parades and certainties. The idea that God might intervene for Britain felt natural, almost necessary. It softened the shock of casualty lists, the disbelief that modern Europe could tear itself apart so suddenly. The Angel of Mons became a shield against the unbearable newness of industrial death. For the men who had fought there, the legend was more complicated. Private John Simpson of the Royal Fusiliers wrote later, "We saw nothing but smoke, mud, and bodies." He admitted he heard the stories later, but added quietly, if there were angels, they kept their wings well hidden. Other veterans remained silent. Perhaps they feared ridicule. Perhaps they understood that myths can be more useful than truth. In London, officials at the War Office neither confirmed nor denied the story. They let it live, a morale weapon more powerful than any rifle. Religious groups seized upon it as proof of divine sanction. Postcards depicting the angels sold by the thousands. One chaplain wrote to the Times, insisting that the hand of the Almighty shielded the British Expeditionary Force. And when Arthur Machen tried once again to deny it, few listened. The war had created its own religion, and he had become its unwilling prophet. But myths have consequences. When the casualty lists from the Marne and the Aisne began to grow, when letters home turned from optimism to endurance, the Angel's glow began to fade. The British Army, though still intact, faced months of trench warfare. The clean Battle of Mons gave way to the filthy stalemate of Ypres. The men learned new words: dugout, barrage, gas. The Angels stayed behind, trapped in that first summer of the war, a relic of innocence already lost. Still, the story would not die. It resurfaced in 1915 in pamphlets distributed among recruits. Some swore that dying men had seen wings descending through smoke. Others said the legend itself saved lives that belief kept men from breaking. Psychologists today might call it collective coping. To them, it was grace. The autumn of 1914 passed, and Europe descended into a kind of madness no soldier had ever known. Trenches stretched like open scars across the map of France and Belgium. Mud swallowed men, horses, and even memory. Yet, in that mire, the legend of Mons took on new life. To the soldiers living like moles beneath the guns, the story of the Angel became a flickering candle, something to whisper in dugouts when the shells stopped falling. Letters home began to blend prayer and rumour. A lance corporal wrote to his mother in Nottingham, claiming, "When we thought the end had come, I saw white figures above the line." Another wrote that the Huns themselves could not pass. Their animals reared and would not charge. Chaplain William Doyle, who served later in Ypres, recorded hearing similar tales from wounded men. None could agree on details, yet all described the same feeling, a calm in chaos, as if some vast invisible hand had paused the storm just long enough for them to breathe. By Christmas of that year, the legend had become national property. Illustrated London News printed etchings of shining bowmen standing over the canal at Mons. Pamphlets from the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge declared it evidence of divine favour upon Britain's cause. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury alluded to heavenly forces protecting those who fight for right. It was wartime theology, wrapped in patriotism and printed in black ink. The War Office, careful as ever, refused comment. They neither confirmed nor denied. And in that silence, the myth thrived. For silence is fertile soil. It allows belief to grow in any direction it pleases. Arthur Machen, watching from London, grew uneasy. He was no propagandist, only a writer of the uncanny. When he saw his fiction reborn as fact, he wrote to the newspapers. He explained that the Bowmen was imagination, a moral allegory, not a report. But each denial was met with scorn. How could a man who had never stood in the trenches know what the soldiers had seen? Machen withdrew from the argument, bewildered by how swiftly a story had become scripture. In later years, he would remark that the real miracle was the speed at which lies travel when people need them to be true. Meanwhile, the war ground on. 1915 brought Ypres the first use of chlorine gas. The Angel of Mons appeared again in soldiers' retellings, now merged with new horrors. Some said the angels returned at Ypres, shielding men from the green mist. Others claimed to have seen luminous forms guiding stretcher-bearers through the fog. The truth mattered less than the comfort it gave. When your world has dissolved into smoke and blood, belief is a form of survival. Yet not all were comforted. Some men despised the legend. They had seen too much to believe in heavenly rescue. Private Harold Chaplin of the Middlesex Regiment wrote bitterly in his diary, "If angels were at Mons, they must have left before the next battle. I've not seen wings, only rats." To him, the legend was an insult to those who had died without salvation. But even cynicism gives shape to faith. Disbelief is still a dialogue with hope. On the home front, the legend took new forms. It appeared in sermons, in recruiting speeches, in music hall songs. A London preacher told his congregation that British purity had summoned celestial protection. A pamphlet circulated claiming captured German soldiers confessed to seeing white horsemen riding before the English line. Each retelling grew more ornate archers, became knights. Knights became angels. Angels became armies. Soon no one could tell where memory ended and invention began. What fascinates historians today is how swiftly this myth took hold in a literate, industrial nation. Britain in 1914 was not medieval. It had telegraphs, railways, typewriters, cameras, yet the first modern war had reawakened medieval fears. Technology had made killing impersonal, and the old gods rushed back to fill the human void. When the rational world fails to explain suffering, the irrational becomes sanctuary. And so, amid machine guns and artillery, men reached instinctively for miracles. By 1916, the Angel of Mons had become both sacred and suspect. Scholars and skeptics began tracing its origins to Machen's story. Publications such as the Occult Review and the Spectator debated it endlessly. Letters poured in from supposed eyewitnesses, though none could produce verifiable detail. Still, the British government quietly encouraged its survival. Morale was precious, and faith, any faith, was ammunition. Meanwhile, Mons itself had been long abandoned. The canal bridges lay shattered, the fields churned to mud. By the time the British returned in 1918, there were no angels, only graves. When the armistice came on the 11th of November, the guns stopped at last. Silence fell like dust on the ruined land. For many survivors, that silence was the only miracle they trusted. But legends do not die in silence. After the war, the Angel of Mons took on a second life, not as propaganda, but as memory. Veterans who could not speak of horror found solace in story. Wives and mothers of the dead found comfort in the idea that their sons had not died alone. In this sense, the legend became a collective act of healing. It transformed fear into meaning, the first, fragile attempt to make sense of mechanized apocalypse. The novelist and war poet Robert Graves, himself a soldier at the front, later wrote that he did not believe in angels, but I knew why others did. That single line captures the paradox of the legend. It was not about wings in the sky, but about the human need for light in darkness. A myth born of desperation became a mirror of the heart, showing not what happened, but what people needed to believe had happened. Over the decades, historians sifted through testimonies. None were first-hand. Every account was hearsay, friend of a friend, priest of a soldier. But the persistence of the story became its own kind of truth. It told us something about faith under pressure, about how a nation's psyche transforms fear into divine narrative. And perhaps that is the most revealing evidence of all, that in the very moment humanity mechanized death, it also resurrected the miraculous. Even in modern times, the Angel of Mons refuses to vanish. Documentaries revisit it, skeptics debunk it, believers defend it. Each generation retells it differently. To some, it's a parable of courage. To others, a case study in wartime propaganda. But at its heart, it remains a love story between faith and survival, a testament to how the human spirit refuses to surrender meaning, even when reason collapses. If you visit Mons today, you will find quiet streets and trimmed lawns. The canal still runs beneath the bridges, rebuilt long after the war. There are memorials, small brass plaques, and weathered stone angels in the local churchyard. And if you stand there at dawn, when the fog hangs low over the water, you can almost imagine the shapes that the soldiers said they saw. Not spectral hosts, but shadows of men who refuse to yield. Maybe that is the truth behind the legend, that the Angel of Mons was never a miracle from above, but something born inside the soldiers themselves, the strength to keep moving when all seemed lost, the courage to believe that endurance had meaning. History gives us battles and dates. Myth gives us the heartbeat behind them. And somewhere between the two lies the ghostly light that those men swore they saw, shining through the gunsmoke on a Sunday morning in August, as the world, young and terrified, stumbled into its first modern war. And so the story endures, not because it happened, but because it needed to.